Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we started a series on sociology and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will discuss the emergence and growth of sociology as well as nature and scope of sociology. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Chaudhary is professor in Center for Study of Social Systems, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studios and request her to start the lecture. Welcome ma'am.
Thank you very much. So the two topics that I am going to address today are emergence and growth of sociology and the nature and scope of sociology. Now the two topics are connected, and as I move along, I will sort of give you a sense of how the two are connected. Just as each one of us are born in a particular place, at a particular time, to a particular family, and a family which may belong to a particular caste, community, region, linguistic group, likewise, these features which inform us and shape us and make us what we are today. The birth of sociology at a specific point of time, at a specific period, at a specific place, in a context shaped by various issues, shapes what sociology is. I begin therefore with what I would say the biography of sociology or the life of sociology. Very often in our textbooks we say that, look, there were three major critical influences which shaped the birth and the growth of sociology. These three critical influences were: 1, the Enlightenment, 2, the French Revolution, 3, Industrial Revolution or the growth of capitalism. Now, in the Indian context, they may seem very far-fetched, very far away, and we may wonder how on earth did those events which happened so far away at another point of time continue to shape not just sociology but our understanding of society in the contemporary context. I would like to elaborate upon each of these phenomena or each of these features, namely Enlightenment, French Revolution, and Industrial Revolution or the growth of capitalism. Now, let us begin with what does the Enlightenment mean. The Enlightenment was a period of time in Europe, roughly beginning from the middle of the 17th century through the 18th century, which was emphasizing the importance of reason, logic, science to understand both social and natural phenomena. Times before that were a time when people believed in the whole question of the world being divinely ordained. That is, we are what we are because this is what divinity expected us to be. The explanations were therefore not sought in the structure of society, but was sought in the divine will of the greater power. So we believed that at that point of time, people accepted whatever was the given norms and expectations of society. The Enlightenment challenged this. They asked questions saying that everything can be understood in the social phenomena just as everything can be understood in the natural phenomena. This is not something which is mysterious, something which cannot be explained, but the methods of science, the methods of reason, the methods of logic can be applied to the realm of the social. So Enlightenment transformed the manner in which we understood society. It transformed the manner in which we understood ourselves, because related to this question of can we understand society as an objective entity which is external to us, which has laws just as there are laws in science, raises a second and a relevant and a connected question. And that second connected and relevant question is that if we are able to understand society, if we are able to figure out what is wrong or what is right in society, it means that we can change society. It means that we can transform society. Take the example for poverty. Now, very often, if we understand poverty as divinely understood or divinely given, then we do not ask, can poverty be removed? We do not ask, can we find out the causes of poverty? But enlightenment transformed our perspective towards understanding the social as the realm which is humanly constructed, and if therefore they are humanly constructed, they can be humanly changed. So the logic of enlightenment was one, critique, nothing is sacred, it can be asked, and it also put forward the question that if society is humanly constructed, then humans can change society. This had revolutionary implications for the way human beings looked at society. It had revolutionary implications directly in actual political revolutions which took place. For instance, the French Revolution, the second phenomena which we had flagged off when we talked about the influences on the making of sociology. The French Revolution, all of you are familiar with, had the very major slogans which we even now talk about: liberty, equality, fraternity. They may seem very routine in the contemporary context. They were not routine at an earlier period. They were truly revolutionary because in a divinely ordered world, we believed that inequality was legitimate, inequality was divinely ordered. The kings were expected and supposed to be ruling over the others. There was divine ordination of kings. Whereas French Revolution raised the question of every human being being born equal. And if you're born equal, your access to resources would be equal. So this was the beginning of what we call democratic principles. Democracy, something which we in our contemporary context continue to practice and live in and often critique the way it functions. What is the third? We've already talked about enlightenment. We showed you the relationship between enlightenment and the French Revolution. We come to the third aspect, and the third aspect is the growth of industrial revolution or the growth of capitalism. How did that make any difference to the way sociology emerged? Now remember, we are talking of a Europe of a long time back, not the Europe that we know of today. That was a Europe which, like many of the other societies in the world, was a traditional society. It was a feudal society. It was a society where you did not have the same scale of urbanization or growth of technology as you have today. And then you had the beginning of scientific and technological innovations. You had what we call industrial revolution. And what happened? What happened was there was a dramatic transformation in the manner human beings lived and in the manner human beings worked, the way what they worked, their occupations, their lifestyle, their everyday practices, whether they lived in towns or cities, questions of migration. I'll give you maybe a few examples to tell you what it meant. It meant that production could not be any longer house-based or household-based. When you had huge machineries, incredible scales of manufacturing, then it was necessary to have large-scale factories, the beginning of towns and cities separate from the villages, and human beings having to go out to work in the industrial sphere. It created new kinds of problems of urban slums, urban livings, working class problems, new problems of women workers in coal mines, new forms of interaction in the streets, large-scale poverty, new forms of anonymity in the urban spaces. And people were concerned. Sociology was bothered. What is it that is happening? And the early scholars, if you look at somebody like Durkheim, or you look at Marx, or you look at Weber, they were all very concerned with what was happening in a society which was being transformed. So they started addressing what became called the social problems of society. So in sociology, we have the influence of the Enlightenment with an emphasis on reason, science, and the spirit of inquiry and critique. We have the influence of the French Revolution with its influence on democratic principles, and we have the concern with new issues of modernity and development which the Industrial Revolution and the growth of capitalism initiated. Sociology, as we understand it today, reflects all these three processes. So when we say that there were these three important events which made an impact on sociology, that is Enlightenment, French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, don't look at it mechanically. Don't look at it as these three instances which then had an impact. Think about sociology inhering, or even today, containing the dynamisms of all these three events. So it is extremely important, therefore, to look at these three as live events of democratic principles, of concerns of capitalism, concerns of market, concerns of labor, concerns of employment, concerns of urban living, questions of how do we people live together in a peaceful, developed fashion, how do we express ourselves as individuals, the ideas of individuality which came with both Enlightenment, French Revolution and capitalism are as relevant today as it was then. So sociology, therefore, is probably a discipline which is completely alive to what is happening today, not in a mechanical application by asking, are the problems then similar to the problems now, but as a discipline which has within it certain theoretical and methodological skills which emerged this long history to understand what is happening here. Now, I sort of move away a little bit from what I've been speaking from so now and ask you, from our Indian context, from a context of 2017, that all that we are saying, is it relevant to us? Did we come to the stage of history much later? Are we lagging behind, as it is often claimed in modernization theory? Or are we, or were we already implicated in that history that I just talked about? And I would like to go back to the question and ask, what were we doing? What was Indian society doing? What was happening to us or our ancestors at the time when we were having the French Revolution or the Industrial Revolution or the Enlightenment? And it would be interesting to look back and see our relationship with that. And I just sort of give you certain kinds of date, for example, that very often we talk about the 18th and the 19th century as the period when Western modernity happened. What were we doing? Were we already just in the realms of tradition, unfamiliar, unknown to the processes of modernity? Or were we already in the process of a very complicated and exploitative relationship with colonial rule which came from the West? Did the Industrial Revolution necessarily mean that there was colonialism which was connected with the growth of capitalism? Did Durkheim write at a period of time when we here in India had already fought the First War of Independence? Was there a connection between the modernity of the West and the modernity of us? What happened to our society through the modernity which emerged in the West? Or how did we study this? Do we study it through sociology which emerged in the West? Or do we have our own categories and our perspectives to understand it? And here is a very, very tricky question. The tricky question is that we cannot go back on history. But what we can do is enable us to look at history critically, take those that are important for us in the contemporary period for a socially just, democratic society, and reject those that were oppressive and exploitative. So if we look back at colonialism and say, what did it do to us? Well, what it did to us, it brought a lot of the industrial development in our country. But that industrial development, since it was driven by the quest for profit by the colonizers, was uneven and exploitative. So railways were brought in, but the railways were primarily in order to develop and take the raw material from our country in order to develop British capitalism. It was developed to bring in workers from one place to another. Remember, the workers who work in Assam plantations today in the tea gardens were taken by the British colonialists from what is present-day Jharkhand. So there were movements of labor, very often forced labor, resettlement, reshaping of the country that we are in. Did it mean everything was terribly oppressive and that the ideas of enlightenment and the ideas of the French Revolution did not impact us at all or did not shape the sociology that took place in our countries? No, it did. It did very much. In fact, you have to understand the entire national movement, the anti-colonial movement, as a certain sense an influence of the ideas of democracy, of liberty, equality, and fraternity. We have to understand the entire 19th century social reform movement and the resistance and critique of colonial rule by looking at a question that these ideas of democracy became very central. These ideas of critique of what was happening through colonialism became very central in the manner in which we articulated our modern self. Remember the slogan, Swaraj is a birthright, was just not a political slogan. It was a slogan which emerged from the same histories that shaped Western modernity, in a certain sense shaped us, but now mediated through colonialism. Did it mean that the social thinkers from India, when they looked at the scholarship which emerged from the West, like sociology, were mechanical consumers of knowledge? Or did they intervene and rethink? Did they negotiate, challenge, and critique? Did they go back and take the knowledge that was there in pre-modern India and engage with what came from the West and say, look, this is our new knowledge, new forms of critique? And I think they did. I think they did very much so. So the fact that sociology departments began early in our country, began to ask questions not only what the Western sociologists were asking, but asking questions what were being raised here. You know, I sort of have deliberately tried to present the growth of sociology in the West and the growth of sociology in our parts as interlinked processes. This is very, very important, not to see this as disparate and disconnected processes, but as processes which are closely connected. Only if we make that connection between knowledge in the book, knowledge in the West, the knowledge in our everyday lives, that we will be able to make sense of what sociology seeks to do, the point that I'll be discussing in detail later, but a point which I want to sort of touch upon here, because the point that I want to emphasize repeatedly, and this is important, is that the birth and the growth of sociology had a defining influence on the nature and scope of sociology. In other words, what do sociologists do? But I come to that later. Right now, I'd like to go back to certain of the points that I have already flagged off and try to make a more systematic ordering of why did I narrate the story of sociology in the manner in which I did. As I began, I said that very often the manner in which our education is practiced, we take certain things as given, certain things as taken for granted. We say that, look, nature and scope is part of our syllabus, emergence is part of our syllabus, so we must study it. Of course, you must study it because it's part of your syllabus. What is much more important to understand, why is it there in the syllabus? What is the logic in trying to understand the birth, emergence, and growth of sociology? And it is that question, that critical question, which to my mind defines the sociological spirit. The sociological spirit constantly asks question, constantly challenges the taken for granted. Why does it do so? Is it related to those three critical influences? Yes, it is related to those three critical influences, because the spirit of the Enlightenment was the spirit of inquiry. Nothing is sacred. Do not accept anything as given. Question your teacher. Question the textbooks. That is the spirit of enlightenment, and that is what the spirit of sociology ought to be. The second question, the question of the French Revolution and how does it impact us? Well, it impacts us because once you say nothing is sacred, you are transforming or recasting or refashioning the way we understand society. We say, look, inequality, poverty, social injustice, war, violence, exploitation, none of this is God's divinely ordained. We have created. If we have created it, then sociology asks, where do we find it? Where do we find it in society? And then therefore sociology starts using categories which is seen to be as scientific. That we cannot understand the society just by looking at it in the manner in which we look at our everyday lives. We can't accept it as taken for granted. We have to say, why am I like this? Why do I speak the language which I speak? What is my family like? Why is my family like this? How do I understand my family? Are all societies have similar families? Are all people similar in different societies? Are in every society mothers and fathers and children similar? If they are not similar, does it mean that there is social variation and this variation can be explained socially? And sociology asks these questions comparatively, because sociology by its very nature is comparative. So here we question, it starts asking the social base of practices. It does not say we believe in it because we believe in it. It does not say we practice child marriage because our ancestors practiced child marriage. We say that child marriages emerge in a particular society at a particular point of time for specific reasons. We ask questions in the rationality of people. We do not just make normal or moral or normative points that why don't poor people send their children to school. We ask instead, we don't say, oh, they're stupid and therefore they don't send their children to school. Instead, we ask what is a sociological question. What are the social conditions which do not allow them or do not encourage them to send their children to school? And if we look at it sociologically, we'll understand that it makes sense to them. It makes sense to their rationality that perhaps the investment that I will have put in my child's education may not get me anything. So maybe if they go to work, it's going to get me something. They're working out from their personal or rather the social rationality in which they are there. So we do not make moral judgment. We do not make moral judgment which are hierarchical, because the democratic influences are very, very strong in the manner in which sociology is practiced. We ask instead, why do a group of people behave in the fashion they do? What are the social structures which impinge upon them? Just like the manner in which in natural sciences ask those questions. Therefore, the influence of enlightenment, the influence of a scientific perspective, the idea of looking at society as an object out there which we can analyze, which we can map, which we can explain, much like the object which is out there in the physical world, is something that became very core, very critical to the manner in which sociology is practiced. The other point that I was wanting to give a lot of influence is the whole question of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And you could ask, how did it influence sociology? Well, it influenced sociology in a fundamental fashion. In a fundamental fashion that sociology is often seen as the discipline which studies modernity, as against a distinction which we may not be able to sustain, but as a distinction which should be flagged off, the relationship between sociology as the discipline that studies modernity as against social anthropology, which was supposed to study societies which were not modern or pre-modern societies. This distinction again has a history. And it's important in the Indian context to look at that relationship between sociology at its birth, its growth, its development, and social anthropology, its birth, its growth, and development, and ask this question, is this division relevant today? Are we still in a position to maintain that gap, maintain and say social anthropology studies pre-literate, simple society, which at one point of time within quotes was called primitive, as against, again within quote, what was called the civilized societies of the West. Does that distinction hold any longer? But before we go into this question of whether the distinction holds any longer, let me just very quickly map the manner in which social anthropology was born, emerged, and developed. Sociology was born, emerged, and developed. I have already flagged off the birth, development, and emergence of sociology with reference to those three defining markers, and also shown how those three defining events have implications in the contemporary context. What I'm more interested now is to see how social anthropology developed. Social anthropology also developed at a roughly the similar period of time. But here, there's a story very central to the manner in which social anthropology began. It began with the question of travel, colonialism, the coming in of Western missionaries, Western administrators, Western colonial rulers into the non-West. So they came and encountered societies like ours, which was different, which was completely different from the societies that they were very familiar with. Very often they came across societies which were not literate, but pre-literate. And they said, okay, these societies are completely different. They used the category other, that anthropology began the study of other societies, the other. They looked at us as the mirror reflection, the opposite of what a modern civilized society was. So it was a very hierarchical way of looking at the other. They saw themselves as the civilized society. They saw us as the barbaric societies. Does it mean that social anthropology has no relevance here at all? It does, because in many parts of our country, and correctly so, social anthropology and sociology are taught together. And most importantly, remember, when we talk about the birth, growth, and development of these two disciplines, we must constantly remember that the birth, growth, and development does not stop at any one point of time. Change is ongoing. If we as human beings are born, become children, become teenagers, adults, slowly become old, nothing is not so different with forms of knowledge. Sociology and social anthropology are also constantly changing. Today, there is greater cooperation between the two, because anthropology has had its moment where they have started reflecting upon that difficult past, the difficult colonial past within which it was born, a difficult past of Western domination and hegemony. It has started asking questions which it could not ask before, because it is amongst us, the non-Western anthropologies are, as they say, the native is talking back. They are asking that maybe you were wrong in depicting the way you did. Maybe you were right. There is a dialogue. There is a possibility of discussion in the contemporary context. So when we talk about the birth, growth, and emergence of sociology, remember, we also have to remember the birth, growth, and emergence of social anthropology. Today, both sociology and social anthropology, because of its contemporary context, have become incredibly more reflexive, more aware of the kind of issues that it is raising, more aware of the ways it's looking into the production of knowledge. I will just very quickly flag off a couple of key points before I stop for the current phase, the current discussion of the birth, growth, and emergence of sociology. The key points are that they emerged in Europe. They emerged with the three developments which are supposed to be constitutive of modernity: Enlightenment, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, or the birth of capitalism. I went on to say that they were unique not just in the West, but in these developments we were already implicated. So modern Western modernity cannot be seen in isolation from its parallel or coterminous, something which happened at the same time, colonialism. We raised questions of how both sociology and social anthropology have to be looked at together. We raised the point that, look, both change over time, just as human beings change, disciplines change, knowledge practices change. This is the critical spirit of enlightenment, of modern rationality, the modern inquiry, the modern interrogation, which we talk today in sociology. Thank you very much. Now, we had just finished our discussion on the birth, growth, and development of sociology. And in this session, what we are going to do is talk about the nature and scope of sociology. Before I go into the details of what constitutes the nature and what constitutes the scope, I'd sort of try and emphasize the fact that it's important to connect it with its history. Very often we have it in the reverse. That is, we first discuss the nature and scope and then we talk about the history. In terms of understanding, I feel that's the wrong way around. And the reason is like this, that if people ask you, why are you like this? Why is your nature like this as a human being? We have to say that we are like this because maybe in my family I was brought up in this way. Maybe, I had a certain relationship with my other members of the family. That is, we talk about our biography when we talk about our nature. Likewise, in the case of sociology, the biography is what it shaped its scope as well as its nature. Now, if we look at the discussion that we had in an earlier session, we had flagged off, like I said, the spirit of inquiry, the scientific method, the rise of modernity, questions of democracy, the inherent nature of sociology to ask questions, And that continues, that kind of effect continues to shape the scope of sociology. However, I think what is important to address is there is a certain kind of, should we say confusion or lack of clarification or certain kind of dispute or contestation between what exactly is the nature of sociology and what exactly is the scope of sociology. There are two extreme views. One view is that sociology or the sociological knowledge is encyclopedic, that it in fact addresses everything. It can inquire into everything. Like people say that it studies birth, it studies death, it studies marriage, it studies education, it studies everything, so its scope is encyclopedic. There is another school of thought which says that, look, the object of inquiry for various disciplines is compartmentalized. So history studies the past, sociology studies the present, political studies talks about the government and administration and the state, and economic studies about production and distribution and other questions of the market. And people could ask that, look, if everybody is studying all these other spheres, then what should sociology study? And then they would say that sociology will only study, in a certain sense, the leftover from those objects of inquiry which economics or political science or history studies. There is a problem here, a grave error of recognizing the true sense of sociology. Because here you're looking at society as compartmentalized. And when you look at society as compartmentalized, it actually goes against the very spirit and nature of sociology. We are not talking about studying just family or just studying kinship or just studying village or just studying caste. We are not talking about the discipline with its reference to the empirical entity that it is addressing. That is, it is not the object of inquiry which defines the nature and scope of sociology. In other words, the object of inquiry is not what shapes what sociology is. It does not mean that sociology studies family and therefore sociology is the study of family. What it means is that sociology brings to the study its own theoretical, methodological skills in order to understand society. Here, therefore, we would very strongly emphasize to move away from an understanding of sociology which sees it as a division of subject matter, that society is divided into parts and sociology studies some parts, other disciplines study other parts. We would like to go back to the encyclopedic vision in some senses of the classical theorists that sociology is a perspective. Sociological method is an approach through which we study. There is a certain pattern through which we understand it. It has a certain kind of mode of inquiry by which it studies society. It inherits its tradition of inquiry by asking questions about everything. It accepts nothing as taken for granted. In order to explain this better about what a sociological perspective is, I invoke another concept, a concept which all of you are familiar with, though very often perhaps you do not see it as a concept, the concept of common sense. What is common sense? We use this term all the time in our everyday life. We say that, look, she's done such a stupid thing, she's left her job. It doesn't make any sense. It is against common sense. We use the word common sense in our everyday life, and what we mean by it, it is practical good sense. That, look, if you have common sense, you will take the right decisions. So common sense is central to the way in which we as members of society live in society. But is sociology and social anthropology, therefore, the study of common sense? Can we say that sociology and social anthropology studies common sense? Here is the tricky part. And the tricky part is that yes, sociology and social anthropology studies common sense, but they do not study it the manner in which we as members of society live it. What do I mean by it? What I mean by that is that common sense in different societies are different. What we may feel is very, very common sense in my society may be very different in another society. The common sense in our country could be that maybe that, look, parents have to look after their children however old they may become. They have a liability, a responsibility to their children. And the children in turn may feel that it's common sense that we may look after our parents. But like you said, like we know, in our societies, changes are taking place. We may have a situation today where children do leave their homes, leave their mothers and fathers once they reach 18 or once they get a job and move out. It's a different society. We are facing a situation where maybe people don't want to look after their old parents. So the common sense of yesterday is no longer the common sense of today. Likewise, the common sense of maybe specific societies in India is not the common sense in another society. For example, in many parts of our country, we have the practice of patrilocality. What do we mean by patrilocality? Patrilocality means that when you get married, you move to the husband's, the male member's house. You live in the house of the husband. But you could have societies like you have the Khazis or the Garos, which is matrilineal. That is a matrilocal, where maybe you live in the house of the wife. Now that means the common sense of one society is not the common sense of another. This kind of theorizing of common sense is very distinctive to the nature of sociology. We just don't say it's obvious, it's common sense. We ask, but what is obvious in which society? What is common sense in which kind of society? For example, today we have a lot of discussion about women and women's right to movement, or women's right to work, or women's right to go to outside and do what she feels like. Now, in a common sense, which is a patriarchal or an old kind of common sense, they said, but only bad girls do that, good girls don't do it. But a common sense of another society would say that, look, it's important for girls to stand up on their own and do it. So common sense varies. Common sense is therefore different from sociological knowledge. Common sense knowledge is different from sociological knowledge. An unfortunate development which has often happened because of the dilution of our educational system is that sociology is often reduced to common sense. So we often see textbooks or guidebooks or writings which reproduce common sense, reproduce the prejudices of common sense in our textbook and pass it off as sociology. This is a terrible thing to happen because sociology, by its very nature and scope, was marked out from common sense. Now, when you have a situation where sociological knowledge becomes part of common sense, then people start saying, but why do we need to do sociology? Sociology is the statement of the obvious. Everybody knows what sociologists say. The tricky part, the difficult part is to make them understand, no, Sociological knowledge is not common sense knowledge. Sociological knowledge asks the difficult question, why do you believe what you do? Why is your common sense your common sense? So the approach of sociology becomes even more difficult because the division is thin but critical between common sense knowledge and sociological knowledge. This critique of common sense of sociology is derived from its past, where it was shaped by the inquiry of reason and science, where you're not willing to accept anything for granted. The second point that I come to after distinguishing sociological knowledge from common sense knowledge is the point, how do we study society? Do we study it the manner in which all of us in our everyday life study society? Firstly, in our everyday life, we do not study society, we experience society. But what sociologists do is they study society through particular methods, through particular informed of particular theories. They do not take the society as given. They do not look at the surface reality as given. They ask very fundamental questions of how do we study, what do we observe. At this point, I'll give you a very, very simple example from a very well-known scholar about the difficulty, or what we could call in sociology, we mean by observation. There was this very well-known scholar, Karl Popper, and one day he goes to a classroom and he tells his students, take out your pens and take out a piece of paper and write down whatever you observe. Now, it may seem a very simple thing. So the students took out their paper, they took out their pen, and they decided to write down what they observed. After just a few seconds, they stopped and they asked him, but what do we observe? How do we know what to observe? Because each person in that room will observe things differently. Somebody may notice the ceiling, somebody may notice a desk, somebody may notice a glass of water. So the question of observation is not self-evident. You will notice only what you are trained to notice. You will not notice what you are not trained to notice. And what do I mean by training? I mean the training of the discipline, the training in its theories, the training in order to use its method, the training in a comparative method to ask these questions. So the distinction of sociology and common sense is not just the knowledge is comparative and relative, but the method through which we gather knowledge is extremely different. Now we come to another aspect, the aspect that there is often a debate that what should be our theoretical or methodological approach to study society. One approach is what the very well-known sociologist Anthony Giddens from Britain says, a naturalistic model. A naturalistic model is derived from natural sciences, and from natural sciences they say that society can also be studied the same way as natural objects are studied. It is no different. The same methods of empirical investigation, the same method of data collection, the same method of analysis, and even some use the word experimental, can be used to study society. They saw it as an object of inquiry which is standing outside the investigator, the naturalistic model. They argued further that just like in the physical world, there are physical laws which operate about, say, temperature, at which temperature water will boil. These pertain to physical laws of nature. Likewise, there are social laws in society, and it is important, therefore, to discover those social laws. And those social laws are not visible to the empirical eye. I just can't go to a village and say, what are the social laws? Those social laws, like the physical laws, have to be deciphered. How will they have to be extricated? How will they have to be extracted? That is why we need theory and method to extract. It gives us a certain method of inquiry through which society has to be studied. This refers to basically the naturalistic model of sociology, the naturalistic nature of sociology. But this was only one approach, the dominant approach, and much that can be commended upon. But there was another approach, and the other approach emphasized the distinction between the study of society and the study of the physical or the natural world. What they said was that, look, human society is fundamentally different from the physical and the natural world. What is it? Why is it so different? The first difference is that we are human beings who are self-conscious and aware. We are not innate, inanimate objects which the scientist studies. We are subjectively feeling and cognitively thinking and acting individuals in society. And the investigator, the sociologist or the social anthropologist is as much a member of this society as his or her object of inquiry. This relationship transforms the nature of sociological inquiry completely from the natural world. That is, we are members of the society and we are studying this society. This makes it all the more challenging because very often our common sense ideas become part of a sociological inquiry. We have to constantly check that and say that, are we reducing our sociological mode of inquiry into our common sense mode of inquiry? In case I'm sounding not very clear, I'll give you an example to illustrate this point of collapsing of the common sense to the sociological inquiry. At one point of time, as you're familiar with, there was a lot of attention drawn to the fact that the lives of women or the works of women were not being adequately incorporated in our knowledge system. In 1975, when we had what is called the second phase of the women's movement, the International Women's Year, the International Women's Decade, a great deal of attention on the purported invisibility of women in knowledge system, this question kept being asked. And a lot of scholars asked that we know physically, all of us know that women work. When we go in a train, we notice that women work in the fields, they work in agriculture, they work in unorganized sector, they work as construction workers, they work as clerks, they work as teachers, they work as engineers, they work in domestic labor, they look after their children, they look after their parents, they are the caregivers. If we all know and if we all physically see women work, then why is it the Indian census has such a low representation in women's work? This was a theoretical question. Common sense, at one level, common sense told us that yes, of course women work. But when we had to represent that knowledge into our academic knowledge, there was something which went wrong. What went wrong? So people started inquiring and they found out that what was the problem was the category of work. That when people go out and collect data, and they collect data that do women work or do women not work, they start finding out that they do not take cognizance or they do not record work which they think is not work. In other words, a lot of women work, but when they ask those women, do you work? They said, no, we don't work. Now, why do they say we do not work, and why does the census person tabulate it as no work? Because there has been a socialization which says that work means employed work, regular work, organized work, professional work. Work which is visible, but work which is not visible, which is part of the largest sector of women's work in our country, went unrecorded because the concept of work did not take that into consideration. Subsequent to that, there was a lot of campaign to change the category of work. And some of you may remember, many of you may not be born at that point of time. In 1991 census, there was an all-out attempt on television everywhere where they would show various kinds of women, breaking bricks, carrying stones, looking after babies, working in industries, making beedis, rolling papas, and they would say, this also is work. What was happening? What was happening was a conceptual reworking, a conceptual transformation. This is what I mean by the importance of sociological knowledge as separate from common sense knowledge. Common sense knowledge would stick to the level of what is observable or what we believe. And we continue to say that earlier on in India, women did not work. that is common sense. Sociological knowledge will ask, women did work in certain sectors at certain times. Women from different communities, castes, class, tribes worked in different spheres. They would, in other way, draw in the social location of women work. So the knowledge, the method of inquiry of sociology, the nature of sociological perspective, the nature of sociology, what it does is fundamentally different from common sense knowledge. This is something we have to be constantly aware because it needs a particular kind of theoretical training in order to understand what the two distinctions are. Now, if I go back and do a kind of quick recapitulation of what we discussed when we discussed the nature and scope of sociology. First point, I said that in order to understand the nature and scope of sociology, you have to go back to its genesis, to the influences which marked its birth and development, to the spirit of inquiry, the spirit of science, rationality, empirical inquiry, empirical data, particular methods, particular theory. Its spirit of inquiry impacted its approach that take nothing as granted. So which other people would say common sense is common sense. There's nothing to study about it. Sociology would say no, common sense is socially constructed. One person's common sense is different from another person's common sense because common sense belongs to communities, groups, to histories and periods. Our common sense will be different from our grandparents' common sense. In other words, the nature and scope of sociology shifts the focus of attention to the social constructedness of a particular phenomena. They do not accept anything as given. The third point is, taking that spirit, what is the method? And the first thing I said that you have to take nothing for granted. Second, if we go back to a scholar like Durkheim, he would say, do not accept anything as given. Get rid of preconceptions which we have. Because as members of society, we all have ideas about family, religion, language, gender. That's natural. We live in society. But the moment we become a sociologist, we have to temporarily keep those ideas in abeyance. Keep it aside and start saying, how do I understand society? Different sociologists had different approaches to study society. But in each one of them, theory was important. Theory was fundamental. So somebody like Durkheim brought in the category of social fact. They said you can't study society just by entering society and observing. I have already told you about the difficulty of observation in abstraction. So he introduced this concept, social fact. It's a simple concept, very simple but extremely difficult to operationalize. Social fact, he said, that is something he wanted to say that in society there are certain facts which can be considered social facts because they're characterized by its social nature, and that we will know a social fact or recognize a social fact by the fact that they're external to us, they are general, they are coercive, and if we resist, they're going to act. Can I give you an example to show what this means? It means, he gives the example, that when we are born, we don't decide that I want to be born in this family. We don't decide that I want to be born in a family which speaks this language or practices that religion. We are confronted with those facts as external to us, as something which is outside us, something if which we challenge, it will be coercive and hit against. So this becomes a certain method. I don't want to go into details about theory and method in this particular unit, because in this particular session, we were trying to look at the whole question of the nature and scope of sociology. And what I have flagged off is the whole question of its scientific perspective, but the fact that it is not comparable to the study of science in its natural sphere Why is it not compatible? Because we are studying human objects which have consciousness. And another point which I have not flagged off, but which I would like to flag off now, that human life is meaningful. We have action is not only something which is physical, but has a meaning which is attributed to it. I'll stop at this point of time, but I hope you have got a sense of the complexity of sociology and the fact that it has an encyclopedic vision and a particular perspective and a theory and method to study society. Thank you.
Ma'am, at this point, in a very short question we would like to ask is that why is knowing about emergence and growth of sociology important in contemporary times, you think?
You know, as somebody who's been involved in teaching for a very long period of time, I think it's important because of two reasons. One reason is that it's the history which shapes the nature of the discipline. The second reason is that very often we take the discipline, sociology itself, as something which is sacred, as that we can't ask questions. We take it as something which is unchanging, something which is fixed, something which cannot be transformed. But the first lesson of sociology is, and the history of sociology is, that sociology itself is a product of society. It's a product of modernity. Until today, in the contemporary period, we are actually living in modern times with all its challenges, its conflicts with tradition, its conflicts with new questions of alienation, anomie. Are they new questions? They're old questions, because the early thinkers of sociology were dealing with issues confronting modernity. In the contemporary context, we continue, in a certain sense of the term, to face similar questions, and sociology has given us those frameworks to ask and answer those questions.
Okay. On that note, we would like to thank ma'am for coming here. And we, dear friends, we hope that with today's lecture you were able to understand the scope and growth of sociology. On that note, thank you dear friends for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.